The Ghost Student ID. My sister never studied at Stanford. Chapter 1. The Confirmation on the Banquet Table. My name is Linda Windsor. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has treated my professional expertise as a convenient resource to be exploited in private and entirely erased in public. To my parents, I was never a daughter to be celebrated. I was the invisible background mechanic, expected to silently absorb their liabilities, rewrite their flawed narratives, and smile through every public humiliation so my older sister could shine. They called me cold. They called me jealous. They demanded I sign away my entire career to fund a multi-million-pound fraud, assuming I was too deeply conditioned by a lifetime of compliance to ever fight back. They thought they had cornered me in a private dining room full of wealthy investors, banking on my habit of keeping the peace to seal their deal. What they didn't know was that the encrypted blue folder resting quietly on my lap was about to make the entire room go completely silent. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where the illusion started. The private dining room at the Midland Hotel in Manchester smelled of polished silver, roasted lamb, and quiet, expensive expectations. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, fractured light over the heavy linen tablecloth, illuminating the carefully arranged name cards that designated where each of us belonged in my family's latest performance. I was seated next to my mother, Helen, whose posture was as rigid and perfectly constructed as the narrative she had spent the last decade building. Across from me sat Julian Ashcroft, the managing director of a prominent London civic tech investment fund, alongside his parents, Sir Malcolm and Lady Beatrice. They were the audience. We were the spectacle. The evening was ostensibly a celebration of the upcoming funding round for CivicMind, an artificial intelligence startup promising to revolutionize how local councils allocated social housing. In reality, it was a thinly veiled engagement dinner, the final societal maneuver required to fuse the Windsor family's carefully curated academic prestige with the Ashcroft family's generational wealth and aristocratic connections. At the center of both the startup and the prospective marriage was my older sister, Evelyn. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, wearing a tailored navy blazer that conveyed the exact right amount of Silicon Valley nonchalance, blended with British formality. She was in the middle of a practice speech about her time at Stanford University, weaving in casual references to late-night coding sessions in Palo Alto, the ethical responsibilities of machine learning, and the professors who had supposedly shaped her vision for algorithmic fairness. Julian watched her with a mixture of professional admiration and personal affection, while Sir Malcolm nodded approvingly at her seamless integration of technical jargon and philanthropic ideals. I looked down at the glossy, heavy-stock brochure resting beside my water glass. It detailed the core team of CivicMind, featuring a professional portrait of Evelyn on the first page. I turned to the second page, my eyes settling on a block of text that I had never authorized, never written, and never agreed to represent. Beneath a small, generic silhouette icon, the crisp black font read, Linda Windsor, Head of Security and Data Integrity. My mother's hand moved under the table, her fingers closing around my wrist like a vice. Helen kept her face turned toward Evelyn, an expression of maternal pride fixed onto her features, but her nails dug into my skin with practiced precision. It was the physical manifestation of a lifelong command, do not ruin this. And, of course, a system dealing with sensitive municipal data requires the absolute highest standard of protection, Evelyn said, her voice projecting effortlessly across the dining room. She turned her gaze toward me, offering a smile that managed to look both sisterly and vaguely condescending. Which is why I brought in my sister Linda. She has audited the entire back-end architecture of CivicMind to ensure our security protocols meet institutional standards. A waiter stepped forward, placing a slim leather portfolio on the table directly in front of me. Inside the portfolio lay a single sheet of paper. It was a formal consent and verification form required by Hawthorne Due Diligence, the external firm auditing CivicMind on behalf of Julian's investment fund. A representative from Hawthorne, a quiet man in a gray suit who had barely spoken all evening, was seated at the far end of the table, observing the exchange. The document required my physical signature to confirm that I had independently tested and verified the integrity of the datasets and security measures Evelyn was selling to the Ashcrofts. Helen leaned in slightly, the scent of her expensive floral perfume masking the tension radiating from her. Her voice was barely a whisper, meant only for my ears, while the rest of the table offered polite applause for Evelyn's speech. "Sign it," Helen murmured, her grip on my wrist tightening another fraction. "Do not make a scene and turn tonight into a joke." From my other side, my father, Graham, shifted in his chair. He reached out to adjust his wine glass, refusing to meet my eyes, before adding his own quiet layer of pressure. "It is only a formality, Linda. Just do it for the family." I looked around the room. Julian was waiting with an encouraging smile. Sir Malcolm and Lady Beatrice were watching me with polite curiosity, expecting the younger, quieter sister to quickly validate the brilliant older sibling. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, her posture radiating absolute confidence, assuming that the sheer weight of the social setting would force my compliance. My parents had engineered this entire evening to corner me in a room full of wealthy, influential people, knowing my natural aversion to public conflict. They thought they had cornered me. What they didn't know was that I had read the metadata of this exact document 6 days ago, and the blue folder currently resting against my ankle beneath the table was about to make the entire room go quiet. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it started. Chapter 2. The Daughter at the Edge of the Frame. Growing up in the Windsor household in Manchester meant learning very early that love was not an unconditional resource. It was a dividend paid exclusively on the performance of social capital. My mother viewed our family as a corporate entity that required constant rebranding and aggressive public relations. In this domestic enterprise, Evelyn was the flagship product. From the time she was a child, Evelyn was labeled exceptional. Helen curated her life with terrifying efficiency, filling the living room with Evelyn's debate trophies, framing certificates from summer academic camps, and constantly weaving Evelyn's minor accomplishments into casual conversations with the neighbors. Evelyn was beautiful, charismatic, and understood exactly how to reflect our mother's ambition back to the world. I was different. I found human interactions unpredictable and exhausting, preferring the logical, binary reliability of machines. While Evelyn was attending elocution lessons and youth leadership seminars, I was taking apart broken routers, salvaging hard drives from discarded family computers, and teaching myself the foundational languages of code. I liked understanding how systems communicated, how data traveled, and, most importantly, where the vulnerabilities in those systems were hidden. To my parents, this was not a talent. It was merely a functional, slightly embarrassing quirk. I was affectionately, though dismissively, referred to as the girl who fixed the computers. The disparity in our value to the family was never explicitly stated, but it was continuously demonstrated through 1,000 small, calibrated dismissals. I remember a specific Thursday in late spring when I was 15. The regional science fair coincided with Evelyn's final interview for a prestigious local leadership scholarship. I had spent 4 months building a localized network security protocol designed to identify and isolate external breaches in the school library's intranet. It was complex, functional, and I had won the first-place medal in the technology division. I stood by my display board in the school gymnasium for 3 hours, watching other parents take photographs of their children. Helen and Graham arrived 20 minutes before the event was scheduled to end. They walked quickly through the double doors, looking slightly out of breath and entirely distracted. When they reached my table, I held up the heavy silver medal, waiting for the validation I still foolishly believed I could earn. Helen looked at the medal, offered a tight, practiced smile, and patted my shoulder. "That is nice, Linda. But please, do not make it a long story on the drive home. Your sister is very tired today from her panel interview, and we need to keep the evening peaceful." My father had looked at the intricate diagrams on my display board, his eyes lingering on the code snippets I had meticulously printed out. For a brief second, I thought he recognized the actual intellectual effort required to build it. But then Helen sighed about the traffic, and Graham immediately turned away, instructing me to pack up my cables quickly so we wouldn't delay Evelyn's celebration dinner. Later that evening, Graham set up a tripod in the living room to take a photograph to commemorate Evelyn's scholarship. The composition of the image was standard for our household. Evelyn stood dead center, holding her official letter. Helen stood on her right, beaming with the intensity of a woman who had just won a personal victory. Graham stood on Evelyn's left, looking proud and secure. I was instructed to stand next to my father. When the flash went off, I knew without seeing the digital preview how the picture would look. Years later, that photograph still sat on the mantelpiece. In it, the three of them form a tight, complete circle of success. I am standing at the very edge of the frame, half of my left shoulder entirely cropped out of the picture, a peripheral figure in their perfect narrative. I did not scream about it. I did not throw the photograph away. I simply learned the lesson they were teaching. Evelyn was the story, and I was the technical support required to keep the story running. Chapter 3. The Day Stanford Knocked. The grand illusion began precisely 2 weeks after Evelyn's 18th birthday, arriving not with a gradual shift, but with an absolute, uncompromising declaration. Evelyn walked down the stairs holding a piece of heavy parchment paper, her voice trembling with manufactured disbelief as she announced that she had been accepted into Stanford University's computer science program in California. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Helen let out a sharp cry, dropping her coffee cup into the sink, and rushed to embrace Evelyn. Graham hurried out of his home office, his face flushed with an emotion that looked dangerously close to relief. Within an hour, champagne was opened, and Helen was already on the phone with her sister, her voice carrying through the house as she repeated the words Palo Alto and Silicon Valley, as if they were aristocratic titles we had just inherited. I was sitting at the kitchen island, quietly filling out my own application forms for a solid, respectable computer science program at a university in the UK. No one asked about my applications. No one poured me a glass of sparkling cider. The gravitational center of the house had violently shifted, and I was entirely outside its pull. Evelyn appeared later that afternoon wearing a brand new, deep red Stanford hoodie that she claimed had been shipped early. She hugged Helen again, crying softly into our mother's shoulder. Helen stroked Evelyn's hair, looking over her head and catching my eye. "A child like this," Helen said, her voice trembling with fierce conviction, "makes every sacrifice worth it. Family takes care of family, and now we are a Stanford family." From that day forward, the Windsor household operated on Pacific Standard Time. Our family routines, conversations, and financial priorities were entirely rewritten to accommodate the geographical and prestigious distance of Evelyn's new life. When Evelyn supposedly flew out to California, the house grew quieter, but her presence became suffocatingly large. The excuses for her absence became the architecture of our daily lives. Evelyn rarely video called because the time zone difference made it too difficult to align schedules. She could not come home for Thanksgiving because Americans celebrated it differently, and she was busy networking. She missed my high school graduation because of finals. She could not return for Christmas because she had secured an exclusive winter internship at a stealth startup. When I asked her about the specifics of her coursework or the programming languages they were prioritizing in her architecture classes, she would wave a hand vaguely and mention that her projects were strictly under a non-disclosure agreement. I wanted to believe it. It was easier to believe that my sister was brilliant and busy than to confront the subtle, jagged inconsistencies that occasionally broke the surface of the narrative. I noticed that the physical acceptance letter, which had sparked the initial celebration, was swiftly framed by Helen and hung in the hallway, positioned just high enough that the smaller text was difficult to read. I noticed that the forwarding email Evelyn sent with her housing assignment had a logo that was slightly pixelated and aligned incorrectly in the header, a formatting error entirely uncharacteristic of a major university's automated system. I also noticed the photograph Evelyn sent from her supposed freshman orientation. She was standing in front of the iconic main quad, wearing her red hoodie, smiling brightly at the camera. The lighting was perfect, but the background was devoid of the chaotic, moving crowds typical of a freshman orientation. She was completely alone in the frame, surrounded by manicured lawns and empty sandstone arches. Whenever I tried to ask detailed questions about her dormitory or her roommates, Helen would seamlessly intervene, steering the conversation back to the prestige of the institution rather than the reality of the experience. I saw the anomalies. My brain, wired to detect structural weaknesses and security flaws, registered every inconsistency. But I chose to classify them as background noise. I was desperate to keep the peace, desperate to avoid being labeled the jealous, cold younger sister who could not handle Evelyn's success. I had spent my whole life acting as the silent mechanism that repaired things in the background, and so I allowed the Stanford myth to exist, completely unaware that ignoring those initial red flags would eventually force me to dismantle the entire family. Chapter 4. Peace is just another word for silence. By the time I was 28, I had built a life in London that was entirely my own. My apartment in Canary Wharf was small, but it was paid for by a salary I had earned through quiet, relentless competence. As a cybersecurity analyst for a corporate risk firm, my daily routine involved dismantling digital illusions. I audited system architectures, traced the origins of spoofed communications, and verified the data integrity of tech startups before major venture capital firms acquired them. If a company claimed they had a proprietary algorithm processing 1 million data points a second, it was my job to look at the server logs and determine if they were telling the truth or running a sophisticated spreadsheet. I was respected in my office. When I spoke in a meeting, senior partners took notes. But the moment I boarded the train at Euston Station to visit my parents in Manchester, my professional identity evaporated. To my colleagues, I was a forensic risk specialist. To my family, I was still the girl who fixed the Wi-Fi router. Evelyn had returned to the United Kingdom after her supposed years in Silicon Valley, carrying a carefully curated aura of entrepreneurial exhaustion. She wore unstructured linen blazers, drank matcha, and spoke in a relentless stream of venture capital buzzwords. She announced that she was founding Civic Mind, an artificial intelligence platform designed to help local governments allocate social housing with unbiased efficiency. Helen immediately seized upon this as the ultimate vindication of her parenting. She began organizing intimate dinner parties, deliberately inviting the wealthiest, most influential families in Manchester to introduce her Stanford-educated founder-daughter. What Helen did not mention to these guests, and what Evelyn worked very hard to conceal, was that a tech founder without a technical background requires a great deal of invisible maintenance. My phone would ring at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It would be Evelyn, her voice tight with suppressed panic because the template-based website she had purchased was displaying a database error. I would receive emails on Sunday mornings containing her investor pitch decks, accompanied by texts asking me to just make sure the back-end slide sounds right. I read those slides. Evelyn routinely confused basic machine learning protocols with standard relational databases. She would draft paragraphs about encrypted civic data pipelines, using terminology that made absolutely no structural sense. Whenever I tried to explain the errors to her, gently pointing out that an investor conducting basic due diligence would spot the flaws in minutes, she would sigh heavily into the receiver. "You are looking at it like an engineer, Linda," she would say, her tone dripping with practiced patience. "Investors buy the vision. The technical details can be outsourced later. Just fix the wording so it flows better." I fixed the wording. I rewrote her architecture slides. I reconfigured the DNS settings on her domain when she accidentally took her own website offline. I did it because every time I hesitated, Helen would call me. "She is your sister, Linda. Family takes care of family. Do not make this a competition just because she is building something public." They did not want my expertise. They wanted my compliance. I was the scaffolding holding up a very expensive, very hollow building, expected to remain completely invisible until something cracked. The dynamic reached its natural conclusion during a Friday evening dinner party at my parents' home in Manchester. Helen had spent 3 days preparing the dining room, importing floral arrangements, and hiring a private chef. The guest of honor was Julian Ashcroft. Julian was 36, the heir to his family's considerable fortune, and the director of a civic tech investment fund in London. He was exactly the kind of man Helen had trained Evelyn to acquire: wealthy, connected, and deeply interested in the intersection of technology and public good. I was only invited because Evelyn needed someone to troubleshoot the wireless projector she planned to use for a casual presentation of her startup after dessert. We were seated around the mahogany dining table, the air thick with the smell of roasted pheasant and Helen's aggressive ambition. Julian sat to Evelyn's right. I was placed near the kitchen door. Julian was genuinely engaged. He leaned forward, swirling a glass of Bordeaux, and asked Evelyn a question about her platform. The concept of unbiased allocation is brilliant, Evelyn. But local council datasets are notoriously unstructured. Are you using a supervised learning model to clean the historical data, or is CivicMind relying on real-time API integrations with their existing housing databases? It was a standard, mid-level technical question. To anyone who had actually spent 4 years studying computer science at Stanford, it would have been a soft pitch. Evelyn froze. It was a microscopic hesitation, invisible to Julian, who was looking at her with quiet admiration. But I saw the slight parting of her lips, the sudden stiffness in her shoulders. She had memorized the pitch, but she did not understand the mechanics beneath it. She had no idea what he had just asked. Evelyn recovered by offering a brilliant, entirely empty smile. She shifted her posture, gracefully redirecting the conversation away from the code and toward the concept. That is exactly the challenge we are addressing, Evelyn said smoothly, placing a hand lightly on the table. The historical data is deeply flawed. But our primary focus right now is ensuring the user interface for the housing officers is seamless. We want to humanize the process first, before we get bogged down in the back-end architecture. She turned her head, looking directly down the table at me. Actually, my younger sister handles a lot of the dry, operational monitoring for us, Evelyn said, her voice bright and conversational. She gestured toward me as if pointing out a reliable piece of household appliance. This is Linda. She does IT. A bit dry, but she has her uses when the servers misbehave. A soft ripple of polite laughter moved around the table. Julian smiled at me, a brief, courteous acknowledgement before turning his attention back to the golden child. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap. I was a senior risk analyst dealing with corporate espionage, reduced to a punchline about fixing servers by a woman who did not know how to write a single line of functional code. I opened my mouth to clarify my actual profession, to perhaps engage Julian on the reality of supervised learning models. Before I could draw the breath to speak, a sharp, sudden pressure slammed into my left ankle beneath the table. It was Helen's velvet heel. She did not look at me. Her face remained turned toward Julian, holding a mask of perfect hostess charm, but her shoe pressed harder into my bone. The message was clear, transmitted through physical force under the cover of expensive linen. Keep the peace. I closed my mouth. I looked at the dark red wine in my glass. I did not correct Evelyn. I did not introduce myself to Julian properly. I sat in silence for the rest of the evening, absorbing the humiliation because I still believed that maintaining the family's fragile ecosystem was my responsibility. I did not know then that my silence was not protecting Evelyn from embarrassment. My silence was the currency they were using to purchase a multi-million-pound fraud. Chapter 5: The Email I Never Signed. 6 weeks before the dinner at the Midland Hotel, I was sitting at my desk in Canary Wharf, running a routine vulnerability scan for a client's cloud infrastructure. The afternoon was quiet, the office bathed in the gray, even light of a London overcast sky. My secondary monitor displayed my personal inbox, mostly filled with automated alerts and newsletters I rarely read. At exactly 3:14 p.m., an email arrived from a domain I did not immediately recognize. The sender was listed as Marcus Thorne, senior auditor at Hawthorne Due Diligence. The subject line was formatted with standard corporate precision: action required, final verification, CivicMind security architecture. I opened the email, my eyes scanning the text with the rapid, mechanical efficiency I applied to all incoming data. Dear Ms. Windsor, thank you for agreeing to serve as the head of security and data integrity for CivicMind. As we finalize the technical due diligence for Mr. Ashcroft's upcoming investment round, We require a final confirmation of your internal system audits. Please find attached the consent form you submitted last week. We merely need you to reply to this email acknowledging that the attached document remains accurate and that you have personally verified the encryption standards of the municipal databases. Best regards, Marcus Thorne. I stared at the screen. The air in my office felt suddenly thin. I moved my mouse and double-clicked the attached PDF. The document loaded onto my screen. It was a standard, legally binding declaration of technical competency and system integrity, filled with complex liabilities regarding data protection laws and investor risk. At the bottom of the second page, resting neatly above a printed line bearing my full legal name, was my signature. It was an electronic signature, but not a typed font. It was a scanned image of my actual handwriting. I leaned closer to the monitor. I recognized the slight, jagged drag on the bottom loop of the letter L. It was a specific artifact created by a faulty digital stylus I had used 3 years ago when I helped my father, Graham, process his life insurance renewal documents online. Someone had located that old PDF in the family's shared cloud drive, cropped my signature, and seamlessly pasted it into a venture capital due diligence form. I did not panic. My profession had trained me to respond to breaches with cold, methodical analysis rather than emotion. I picked up my phone and dialed Evelyn's number. She answered on the third ring. The background noise suggested she was in a busy cafe, the faint sound of an espresso machine hissing behind her cheerful voice. "Linda, I was just about to call you," Evelyn said, sounding utterly unbothered. "Julian and I are looking at flat renovations in Kensington, and the contractor wants. Why is my signature on a Hawthorne due diligence form regarding Civic Mind?" I asked. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping it of any familial warmth. There was a brief pause on the line. The ambient noise of the cafe seemed to amplify. When Evelyn spoke again, her tone had shifted into the patronizing, patient register she used whenever she felt I was failing to grasp a larger social concept. "Oh, that. You always make everything so incredibly serious, Linda. It is just a placeholder title." Julian's legal team needed a name attached to the technical side of the pitch deck to push the paperwork through the initial compliance stage. "I used yours because you actually know what you are doing. You should take it as a compliment. You forged my signature on a legal document submitted to an investment firm," I stated, focusing strictly on the facts. "That is not a placeholder. That is fraud." Evelyn sighed heavily, a sound designed to convey how exhausting it was to deal with my rigid boundaries. "Nobody is going to sue anyone, Linda. Julian's fund is already committed to the vision. The auditors just need boxes checked. I am not asking you to build the system. I just need you to leave your name there until the funding clears next month. Then I will hire a real chief technology officer and transition you out. Nobody will ever know. I want my name removed from the application immediately," I said. "And I will not reply to Hawthorne confirming a system I have never seen." "Linda, please," Evelyn's voice sharpened, losing its breezy facade. "If you pull your name now, Hawthorne will flag it as a discrepancy. They will delay the funding round. Do not ruin this for me just because you are jealous of what I have built." I ended the call without responding to the accusation. I did not delete the email from Marcus Thorne. Instead, I saved a secure, encrypted copy of the PDF to my local drive, preserving the metadata that clearly showed the document had been created and modified on a laptop registered to Evelyn Windsor. That evening, I was sitting at my kitchen counter in silence when my phone lit up with a call from Helen. I watched it ring twice before answering. "Linda, your sister is in tears," Helen began, bypassing any greeting. Her voice was taut with the specific brand of authoritative anxiety she used to govern the family. "She told me you are threatening to sabotage her investment round over a simple administrative oversight." "It is not an oversight, Mother. She forged my signature on a legally binding document. She borrowed your name to help the family," Helen corrected smoothly, reshaping reality to fit her needs. "You have a good job, Linda. You have your quiet little life in London. Evelyn is on the verge of something massive. Julian Ashcroft is not just an investor, he is her future. If you make a scene over a piece of paper, you will embarrass her in front of the Ashcrofts, and you will destroy her chance at a secure marriage. Behind Helen's voice, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of my father speaking. "Tell her we will pay any legal fees if it comes to it. Just keep the peace." Helen ignored him, pressing her advantage. "I am asking you to do this one thing for your sister. Do not reply to the auditor. Do not cause a problem. Just let the process finish." I looked at the glowing screen of my laptop, where the forged signature still sat open on the display. For my entire life, I had allowed my family to borrow my time, my skills, and my silence to prop up Evelyn's image. I had accepted the role of the background mechanic because the cost of fixing their mistakes was always lower than the cost of fighting them. But sitting in my apartment that night, I realized the rules of their game had fundamentally changed. They were no longer asking me to fix a broken slide deck or sit quietly at a dinner table. They were demanding that I absorb their legal liability. They expected me to offer up my professional reputation, the only thing I had built entirely on my own, as collateral for Evelyn's lies. "I will not sign it, Mother," I said quietly. I hung up the phone before she could launch another counterattack. I opened a new browser tab and typed in the URL for the National Student Clearinghouse, the centralized database for university degree verification. If Evelyn was willing to construct a fraudulent company using my identity, I needed to know exactly what other structural weaknesses existed in the foundation of the life she had built. I requested an official verification of Evelyn Windsor's attendance and graduation records from Stanford University. It was a standard background check, the kind I ran on tech founders every single week. Then, I waited for the automated system to deliver the truth. Chapter 6. No record found. The digital clock in the lower right corner of my primary monitor shifted to midnight. The National Student Clearinghouse portal indicated that official degree verifications could take up to 2 business days to process, but I knew from professional experience that automated records from major institutions often returned initial queries within hours. While I waited for the automated system to search its vast databases for Evelyn's academic history, I turned my attention back to the digital dossier Hawthorne due diligence had attached to their email. I approached the files not as a younger sister looking for an explanation, but as a forensic risk specialist executing a standard audit. Investors like Julian Ashcroft were frequently blinded by the halo effect of social proof. When a founder possessed the right accent, the right tailored wardrobe, and the right network of introductions, due diligence often stopped at the surface because the surface looked so incredibly expensive. My job was to look beneath the upholstery, and I began by opening the supplementary verification documents Evelyn had submitted to prove the origins of Civic Mind. The first document was a forwarded email chain, supposedly confirming a meeting between Evelyn and her academic advisor in the Stanford Computer Science Department regarding her final thesis. I extracted the raw text of the email header. A genuine university email routes through a complex, highly secure internal institutional server architecture. The routing data on Evelyn's supposed faculty confirmation possessed an originating IP address that traced directly back to a discount commercial web hosting service based in Iceland. Furthermore, when I cross-referenced the professor's name with the university's public faculty directory, the individual did exist, but the contact email Evelyn had provided in the file was a carefully misspelled commercial Gmail account, not an official academic routing address. Next, I examined the scanned image of her student identification card, a document she had clearly used to bypass the initial compliance checks at Julian's investment firm. To the naked eye, it looked authentic, complete with a high-resolution university seal and a standardized barcode. However, the QR code positioned in the bottom corner caught my professional attention. I ran the image through a diagnostic scanner on my secure network. Instead of directing the query to an encrypted administrative portal, the code resolved to a privately registered domain name hosted on a generic, drag-and-drop website builder. I then accessed the public GitHub repository linked to CivicMind's early development phases. Evelyn repeatedly claimed to investors that she had coded the foundational data sorting algorithms herself during her final months in California. I reviewed the commit history, analyzing the metadata attached to every line of code uploaded to the server. The time zone logs and user agent data did not match a student working late nights in Pacific Standard Time. Instead, The upload patterns pointed consistently to a subnet in Bucharest, Romania, an area universally recognized in the tech industry as a major hub for outsourced freelance developers. The repository demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of backend architecture that directly contradicted the woman who had asked me how to restart a local server only 3 weeks ago. The inconsistencies were entirely too deliberate. They were not the chaotic errors of a disorganized graduate. They were the calculated artifacts of a manufactured identity. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the lines of code on my screen as a specific, physical memory from 6 years ago suddenly surfaced. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Manchester. Evelyn had walked into my bedroom, tossing a cheap, red plastic USB drive onto my keyboard. She had been wearing her signature red university hoodie, looking utterly exhausted by her own perceived brilliance. "Fix the formatting on my thesis draft," she had commanded, already turning to leave the room. "And do not go opening my personal folders, Linda. You always snoop." I had plugged that drive into my secondary laptop and immediately detected a low-level Trojan virus attached to one of the root directories. Following standard security protocols, I had created an exact, isolated image of the drive on my secure external server before wiping the physical USB clean, fixing the margins on her single text document, and handing it back to her. I had completely forgotten about the quarantine disk image until this exact moment. I accessed my encrypted archives, navigating through years of closed corporate audits until I located the specific disk image dated 6 years prior. I mounted the drive in an isolated sandbox environment and opened the directory. The files contained within were not the chaotic remnants of academic research. They were the raw, unpolished materials of a comprehensive fabrication. I opened a folder labeled Administrative. Inside was a digital file named admission_letter_v3_final. It was a composite document, pieced together using a high-resolution scan of the official university letterhead and standard admission text that possessed slight kerning errors in the typography, suggesting it had been copied and pasted from a public admissions forum. Beside it sat student_ID_front_test.png, an image file displaying 3 different crops of Evelyn's face against a digitally inserted white background, testing which angle looked most like an official photograph. I moved to a subfolder marked California Trip. Here were the unedited source files for the orientation photographs that currently hung in silver frames on my mother's living room wall. The uncompressed metadata revealed they had not been taken in September during a bustling freshman orientation week. They were captured in mid-July, during a public campus tour, specifically on a Tuesday afternoon when the main quadrangle was predictably devoid of actual students. However, the most definitive piece of evidence was a simple, unformatted text document nestled in the main directory. It was titled Stanford Story, Do Not Send to Mom. I clicked it open. It was a rehearsal script. The document contained meticulously organized bullet points detailing specific architectural features of the campus buildings, the exact operating hours of popular local coffee shops in Palo Alto, and pre-written, highly specific anecdotes about difficult professors. Evelyn had rigorously studied these details to ensure her casual conversations at our family dinner table possessed the necessary texture of reality. The title of the file indicated a desperate desire to keep the mechanics of the lie hidden from Helen, painting a picture of a daughter terrified of disappointing a demanding mother. As I stared at the script, a clean, white notification banner appeared on my secondary display. The automated email from the National Student Clearinghouse had arrived earlier than expected. I moved my cursor and opened the secure message. The verification report was a single, system-generated page, stripped of any emotion or familial context. I scanned past the institutional headers and the legal disclaimers until I reached the primary data field. The text in the center of the screen was stark, unambiguous, and absolute. Target subject, Evelyn Windsor. Enrollment status, no record found. Degree awarded, no record found. She had never been a student. She had not dropped out due to stress. She had not transferred to another program. She had not deferred her enrollment for a gap year. There was no admission file, no student identification number, no academic record, and no actual faculty advisor. The entire foundation of her adult life was a phantom structure built on tourist photographs and hired code. I sat in the absolute silence of my apartment, the blue glow of the monitors casting long, cold shadows across the hardwood floor. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication, nor did I feel the sharp, satisfying sting of uncovering a rival's secret. What washed over me was a profound, suffocating weight that settled heavily in my chest. For over a decade, my family had structured our entire existence around a ghost. My parents had celebrated, financed, and worshipped a version of my sister that was entirely assembled from stolen logos and rented backdrops. And every single time I had been told to step aside, to lower my voice, to suppress my own achievements, and to accept my designated place at the very edge of the family photograph, it had been to make room for a person who did not even exist. Chapter 7. The Blue Archive Folder. I did not immediately confront my family with the National Student Clearinghouse Verification Report. Exposing a lie of this magnitude required more than a single piece of contradictory evidence, especially when dealing with individuals who had spent over a decade perfecting the art of defensive reality distortion. I needed to understand the entire structural framework of the deception before I could effectively dismantle it. The following morning, I drafted a meticulously polite email to my mother, my father, and Evelyn, copying all three of them on the correspondence. I stated that if they genuinely expected me to sign the Hawthorne due diligence forms and attach my professional liability to the Civic Mind funding round, I required unrestricted access to the complete, unredacted administrative and historical files of the company. I framed the request purely as a standard operational procedure, mimicking the exact corporate language I used with my corporate clients in London. Helen replied less than 20 minutes later. Her response was dripping with the magnanimous relief of a parent who believed their difficult child had finally decided to submit to the natural order of the household. I am so glad you have decided to stop being difficult and start acting like a supportive sister, Linda, Helen wrote, her words carrying the familiar, subtle sting of conditionality. Family takes care of family. Evelyn has authorized the transfer of the back-end documentation. Julian is taking us all to the Midland Hotel to celebrate the finalization of the term sheet next week, and we expect you to bring the signed paperwork with you. Attached to the bottom of her email was a secure hyperlink directing me to a cloud storage directory managed by the startup. I downloaded the entire directory to my encrypted local server, organizing the contents into a digital workspace. At first glance, the repository was impeccably maintained. There were subfolders dedicated to financial projections, municipal marketing strategies, and beautifully designed presentation decks featuring Julian Ashcroft's Civic Tech Fund logo. It was the exact kind of polished, superficial corporate administration that routinely passed initial investor scrutiny. However, my objective was not to review their marketing materials. I was searching for the foundational cracks in the architecture. I ran a deep-level directory scan, filtering the contents not by their display names, but by their original creation dates and hidden metadata tags. The scan isolated a compressed archival folder buried 4 levels deep within a directory labeled Miscellaneous Financials 2018. The digital icon of the folder was highlighted in a default system blue, sitting quietly among the sterile spreadsheets. It possessed a highly irregular file name that immediately triggered my professional instincts. The file was titled Evelyn_education_narrative_private.pdf. I moved my cursor over the blue icon and extracted the contents into my secure viewing sandbox. The document was not a single file, but a merged portfolio containing over 50 pages of high-resolution scanned correspondence, financial receipts, and legal agreements. I adjusted the contrast on my monitor and began reading the first page. It was a scanned image of heavy, cream-colored stationery bearing the official crest of the Stanford University Office of Undergraduate Admission. The letter was addressed directly to Evelyn Windsor at our childhood home in Manchester. Dear Evelyn, we deeply regret to inform you that we cannot offer you admission to the incoming freshman class. I checked the timestamp printed on the institutional postage mark at the top right corner of the scan. The rejection letter had physically arrived at our house in Manchester exactly 11 days before Helen had purchased the imported champagne, filled our living room with neighbors, and proudly announced that Evelyn was moving to Silicon Valley. The revelation forced me to stop reading and simply stare at the illuminated screen. For 24 hours, I had operated under the assumption that Evelyn was a desperate, manipulative architect who had somehow managed to deceive our fiercely ambitious parents. I had believed that Helen and Graham were merely arrogant victims of their favorite daughter's magnificent fraud. The documents displayed on my screen completely obliterated that theory. They had known. They had known before the first celebratory toast was ever poured. I scrolled down to the subsequent pages in the portfolio, my stomach tightening as the true nature of my family's enterprise revealed itself. The following section contained a lengthy email chain between my mother, Helen, and a boutique reputation management agency located in Palo Alto, California. The agency specialized in constructing digital footprints and academic optics for the children of wealthy international clients. "We do not need to fabricate an entirely fraudulent degree," Helen had written in an email dated 3 weeks after the rejection letter arrived. "We simply need Evelyn to possess the physical and digital appearance of a Stanford student long enough for our social circle to stop asking specific questions. She needs the right geographical markers, the right wardrobe, and a plausible reason for remaining in California while she decides on her next venture." The agency had responded with an itemized invoice, which was included on the next page of the PDF. My father, Graham, had authorized the international wire transfers from his personal wealth management account. I reviewed the receipts with a cold, terrifying clarity. Graham had paid for the 6-month lease on a luxury short-term rental apartment situated precisely 2 miles from the Stanford campus. He had paid the consulting agency's exorbitant fee for an academic profile cleanup, which included the commissioning of the fake student identification card I had discovered earlier. There were even receipts for a professional photographer hired to follow Evelyn around the public areas of the university during the summer term, capturing the meticulously staged orientation pictures that Helen currently displayed on our mantelpiece. They had not protected their daughter from the crushing disappointment of failure. Instead, they had determined that a rejected daughter was an unacceptable liability to their social standing in Manchester, and they had collectively decided to monetize her failure by transforming it into a long-term investment project. The final section of the blue digital folder was the most devastating. It was a strategic document, authored primarily by Helen and heavily annotated by Graham, explicitly titled the Julian Trek. It was a comprehensive relationship acquisition strategy. The document contained a curated list of high-net-worth philanthropic boards, exclusive civic technology conferences in London, and private charity galas. Beside each event was a detailed note regarding the likelihood of Julian Ashcroft or his parents being in attendance. At the bottom of the strategy document, Graham had written a summarizing paragraph to Helen, his tone dripping with the cold pragmatism of a venture capitalist evaluating a risky startup. The ongoing costs of maintaining the Californian narrative are becoming substantial. However, if Evelyn can leverage the civic mind concept to secure a position in a reputable accelerator, or more importantly, if she successfully secures a marriage proposal from Julian Ashcroft, the return on investment will neutralize the initial deception. The beginning of the story will cease to matter once she is permanently secured within the Ashcroft family infrastructure. Evelyn was not a rogue mastermind operating in the shadows. She was the lead actress in a corporate production directed by my mother and financed by my father. And I was the disposable, in-house technical support, expected to silently repair the crumbling digital set pieces whenever the illusion threatened to collapse. I closed the PDF portfolio, the soft blue light of the monitor reflecting off the dark windows of my Canary Wharf apartment. The anger I felt was no longer the chaotic, reactive frustration of a younger sister who had been constantly overlooked. It was the precise, crystallized fury of a professional who had just discovered that her own family was attempting to make her an accessory to a systemic, multi-million-pound financial and emotional fraud. They believed they had absolute control over the narrative because they had spent 30 years training me to prioritize their peace over my own reality. They assumed I would sign the Hawthorne verification form because I had always quietly absorbed the consequences of their ambition. They were exceptionally competent at calculating social leverage, but they had fundamentally miscalculated my willingness to go down with their sinking ship. Chapter 8. Do not destroy your sister's future. I sent the text message to Evelyn at 7 o'clock the following morning, requesting a meeting at a neutral location in central London. I chose an upscale, minimalist coffee house in Marylebone, an establishment characterized by polished concrete floors, brass fixtures, and a clientele that treated casual networking like an Olympic sport. It was precisely the kind of environment where Evelyn felt entirely secure, surrounded by the affluent entrepreneurial aesthetic she had spent years mimicking. She arrived 20 minutes late, an intentional delay designed to establish the hierarchy of our interaction. She was wearing a tailored beige trench coat over a silk blouse, carrying a leather tote bag that looked heavy with the supposed responsibilities of a corporate founder. When she slid into the booth opposite me, she did not offer a greeting or an apology for her tardiness. She immediately signaled a waiter, ordered a courte-du with oat milk, and turned her attention to me with an expression of profound, maternal exhaustion. "I really do not have time for this today, Linda," Evelyn began, arranging her phone and designer sunglasses on the table with deliberate precision. "Julian has scheduled back-to-back meetings with the legal team to finalize the term sheet, and Hawthorne is pressing us for your verification form. You are making a massive issue out of standard corporate administration because you have always wanted to prove I am not worthy of the things I have built." She deployed the accusation smoothly, relying on the same defensive architecture our mother had utilized for decades. The strategy was always to reframe my demand for accuracy as a manifestation of deeply rooted sibling jealousy. I did not defend myself. I did not attempt to explain the legal definitions of electronic forgery, nor did I engage with her commentary about my character. I simply reached into my leather satchel, extracted the single sheet of paper I had printed from the National Student Clearinghouse portal, and placed it face up on the polished wooden table between us. Evelyn stopped talking. She looked down at the document. The bold, unambiguous text of the official verification report rested squarely in her line of sight. Target subject, Evelyn Windsor. Enrollment status, no record found. Degree awarded, no record found. I watched her process the information. It did not happen instantly. It was a gradual, agonizing dismantling of the confident persona she had worn into the cafe. Her posture lost its rigid corporate elegance. The color slowly drained from her face, leaving her skin looking pale and distinctly fragile beneath the warm ambient lighting of the restaurant. Her perfectly manicured fingers reached out, hovering just above the paper as if touching the physical evidence would somehow make the words permanent. When she finally looked up at me, the arrogant tech founder was entirely gone. In her place sat the terrified 18-year-old girl who had been handed a rejection letter and told by her mother that failure was not a permissible option. "Where did you get this?" Evelyn asked, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper that barely carried across the narrow table. "It is a standardized institutional database search, Evelyn," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level, devoid of either triumph or pity. "It is the exact same automated protocol that any competent venture capital auditor will run if they decide to look past your aesthetic and actually evaluate your credentials. They will not ask for your permission, and they will not warn you before they access the records." Evelyn pulled her hands back and crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a physical barricade against the reality I had just placed on the table. She looked wildly around the cafe, terrified that the elegant strangers sitting nearby possessed the ability to read the document from a distance. "I wanted to tell everyone the truth," Evelyn said, the words rushing out of her in a desperate, broken cadence. She was no longer looking at me, she was staring at her reflection in the dark window pane beside our booth. The day the letter arrived from California, I went downstairs to tell them. I was holding the envelope in my hand. But Mum had already invited the neighbors over for champagne. She was standing in the kitchen, telling Mrs. Gable about the computer science department. I walked into the room, and she looked at me with this absolute, terrifying pride. She paused, her breathing shallow and uneven, trapped in the memory of the exact moment her life had diverged from reality. I told them later that night, after everyone left. Evelyn continued, a tear finally escaping and tracking through her expensive foundation. Dad sat in his armchair and just stared at the wall. Mom took the letter from my hands, walked over to the shredder in the home office, and destroyed it. She turned around and told me that the story had already been established. Dad said we would just get through the summer, that we could figure out a transition plan later. But the summer ended, and Mom had already hired the consultant. She bought the plane tickets. She told me to just play the part until I figured out a real business. I listened to her recount the exact sequence of events I had already verified through the blue archival folder on my encrypted drive. Hearing the confirmation directly from her did not soften the betrayal, it only solidified the sheer mechanical coldness of our family dynamic. They had built a gilded cage of expectations, and Evelyn had willingly walked inside and locked the door because the alternative was returning to the ground as a normal, unremarkable person. You do not understand what it is like, Linda, Evelyn pleaded, leaning forward across the table, her eyes begging for a specific kind of absolution I was completely unable to provide. You are always allowed to be normal. If you failed a test or if you did not get into a program, nobody cared. The house did not collapse. They expected me to be the exception. I was not allowed to be anything less than spectacular. I looked at my sister, acknowledging the genuine, suffocating tragedy of her position. She had been sacrificed on the altar of our parents' social ambition, traded for dinner party anecdotes and the envy of the local neighborhood watch. She was a victim of their relentless architectural control. But recognizing her as a victim did not blind me to the fact that she was currently attempting to use my life as a human shield. No, Evelyn, I said, ensuring my voice carried the absolute weight of a finalized boundary. I was never allowed to be normal. I was simply not allowed to matter. My achievements were minimized so yours could occupy the entire room. My boundaries were erased so your mistakes could be quietly repaired. You're correct that they built this trap for you, but you're the one who decided to drag my professional reputation into it to save yourself. Evelyn recoiled slightly, stung by the refusal to accept her narrative of shared victimization. She wiped the tear from her cheek, her expression hardening as the desperation began to curdle into resentment. I am not asking you to take the fall, Linda, she argued, her tone shifting back toward the manipulative register she used to manage our parents. Julian's fund only needs the technical verification document to clear the compliance threshold. Once the capital is secured, Civic Mind becomes a real entity. I can hire actual engineers to build the backend. The fiction becomes reality, and your name is removed from the company registry within 30 days. Nobody gets hurt. If you submit that forged signature to Hawthorne due diligence, you are committing wire fraud and misrepresenting material facts to a financial institution, I explained patiently, outlining the exact legal parameters of the disaster she was inviting. If they audit the platform and realize the data sets are manipulated samples, they will trace the verification back to the supposed head of security. They will come after my credentials, my career, and my freedom. I reached across the table and retrieved the printed verification report, folding it neatly and placing it back into my leather satchel. I will not attend the dinner at the Midland Hotel next week, and I will certainly not sign the Hawthorne verification form, I told her, gathering my coat and standing up from the booth. You have 48 hours to contact Julian's legal team and officially withdraw my name from all Civic Mind documentation. If you do not remove me from your fraudulent architecture, I will contact Marcus Thorne directly and inform him that my signature was utilized without my consent. Evelyn remained seated, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic mixed with a deep, childish fury. The realization that I was no longer willing to absorb the impact of her failures was finally settling into her framework. She realized I was stepping out from beneath the structure, and without my support, the entire edifice was going to collapse directly onto her. If you walk away and refuse to sign that paper, you destroy everything, Evelyn said, her voice rising slightly, drawing a brief, curious glance from a businessman at the adjacent table. You destroy the company. You destroy my relationship with Julian. You will humiliate Mom and Dad in front of the Ashcrofts. You will tear this entire family apart over a technicality. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent a decade wearing a stolen university hoodie while I quietly fixed her broken servers in the background. I am not destroying anything, Evelyn, I replied quietly. The foundation was always made of sand. I am just refusing to stand underneath it when the roof finally caves in. I turned and walked out of the coffee house, stepping into the cool, damp air of the London street, leaving her sitting alone with the bill, the silence, and the terrifying weight of a reality she could no longer outsource. Chapter 9. The Dinner at the Midland. The Midland Hotel in Manchester is a monument to Edwardian excess, a vast structure of red brick and terracotta that has spent over a century hosting the quiet, expensive transactions of the city's elite. Walking through its heavy glass doors felt like stepping onto a meticulously designed theatrical stage. I arrived precisely on time for the dinner, carrying a slim, black leather portfolio tucked neatly under my left arm. My intention that evening was not to destroy my family in front of an audience. I am an auditor, not an executioner. My plan was entirely professional. I intended to arrive before the main dinner service, locate Marcus Thorne, the representative from Hawthorne Due Diligence, and privately submit a formal, written declaration stating that my name had been used without my consent. I wanted to execute a quiet extraction, leaving Evelyn and my parents to explain my sudden absence to the Ashcroft family however they saw fit. But my mother had anticipated my resistance. Helen understood that isolation was my preferred operational environment, and so she completely removed it as an option. The moment I stepped into the private dining room, Helen was suddenly beside me. She did not offer a greeting. Instead, she laced her arm tightly through mine, her manicured fingers pressing into my bicep with the unyielding force of a steel clamp. "You are late," Helen murmured, her voice a flawless imitation of maternal affection designed entirely for the benefit of the room. "Come sit down. We are just about to begin the toasts, and Julian has been asking about you." She guided me forcefully toward the long mahogany table, completely blocking my path to where Marcus Thorne was seated at the far end of the room. He was a quiet man in a tailored gray suit, nursing a glass of sparkling water. When our eyes met briefly, he did not smile. He simply offered a fraction of a nod, an acknowledgement of the encrypted email I had sent to his secure corporate address precisely 4 hours earlier. Helen forced me into the chair to her immediate right. Julian Ashcroft sat across from us, looking deeply comfortable in his wealth, while his parents, Sir Malcolm and Lady Beatrice, occupied the seats of honor. Evelyn was positioned at the head of the table, radiating the specific, polished glow of a tech founder on the verge of a massive acquisition. The strategy was immediately apparent. By seating me directly beside her and placing the investors across the table, Helen had transformed the dining room into a social panopticon. I could not speak to the auditor. I could not quietly excuse myself, and I could not reject the paperwork without doing it under the direct scrutiny of the aristocratic family they were so desperate to impress. Once the first course was cleared, Helen tapped her silver spoon against the edge of her crystal water glass. The ambient conversation around the table instantly dissolved into polite, expectant silence. Helen stood up, smoothing the front of her designer dress. She looked around the room, her gaze resting warmly on Julian and his parents before settling on Evelyn. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," Helen began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of a seasoned board member. "When Graham and I first realized Evelyn's potential, we knew that raising a truly exceptional child requires more than just love. It requires investment. It requires a family willing to sacrifice their own comfort to ensure that brilliance is given the platform it deserves. Evelyn has always been the proof that if a family invests in the right place, a child can change the world." The words were delivered with a smile, but the subtext was a precise, calculated strike against me. It was a public declaration of the household hierarchy. She was reminding me, in front of billionaires and auditors, that my entire existence was merely the operational overhead required to fund Evelyn's brilliance. Sir Malcolm raised his glass in a silent gesture of agreement, clearly moved by the narrative of maternal sacrifice. Evelyn stood up to take her mother's place. She looked immaculate. She did not look like a woman who had panicked in a Marylebone coffee shop 48 hours ago. She had entirely compartmentalized her terror, stepping effortlessly back into the character she had played for a decade. "Thank you, Mother," Evelyn said, her voice projecting with smooth, rehearsed confidence. She looked directly at Julian. "When I was studying at Stanford, surrounded by all that incredible innovation in Silicon Valley, I realized that technology without ethics is just empty math. Civic Mind was born from the belief that algorithmic fairness is a basic human right. We are not just building software, we are building trust." She paused, allowing the weight of the buzzwords to settle over the table. Julian watched her with absolute devotion, entirely captivated by the illusion. But as the silence stretched, I noticed Julian's gaze briefly shift toward me. He was an investor who evaluated human behavior for a living, and my absolute, frozen silence was beginning to register as an anomaly in the otherwise perfect room. Evelyn caught the shift in his attention. She immediately pivoted, weaponizing the audience exactly as she had been trained to do. "And speaking of trust, a system dealing with sensitive municipal data requires the absolute highest standard of protection," Evelyn said, turning her practiced smile toward me. "Which is why I brought in my sister Linda. She has audited the entire back-end architecture of Civic Mind to ensure our security protocols meet institutional standards." The room's collective attention snapped onto me. Lady Beatrice offered a polite, encouraging smile. Graham shifted uncomfortably in his chair at the far end of the table, suddenly very interested in his napkin. A waiter stepped seamlessly out of the shadows, placing a slim leather portfolio directly onto the heavy linen tablecloth in front of me. Beside it, he placed a heavy, silver fountain pen. It was the Hawthorne due diligence verification form. They had printed it out. They were forcing a physical signature in a room full of witnesses, gambling my entire professional identity on the belief that I was too well trained, too deeply conditioned by a lifetime of compliance, to publicly embarrass them. Helen leaned in slightly, the scent of her floral perfume suddenly suffocating. Her hand slid under the table, her fingers closing around my wrist with enough force to bruise. "Sign it," Helen murmured, her voice dropping to a register that only I could hear. "Do not make a scene and turn tonight into a joke." From across the table, Evelyn maintained her brilliant, public smile. But her eyes were dark with a desperate, underlying threat. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table, and delivered the final mandate. "Sign it, Linda," Evelyn whispered softly, the words masked by the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Do not be bitter." I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the heavy parchment paper demanding my complicity. And then I moved my left hand, resting it on the cover of the black leather portfolio I had brought with me. They thought they had cornered me. They thought the pressure of the Ashcroft family's wealth and the sheer weight of the social setting would crush my resistance. What they failed to understand was that they had not trapped me on their stage. They had simply gathered the entire audience required to witness their own collapse. Chapter 10. No Record of Admission. I picked up the heavy silver fountain pen, feeling the cool metal against my skin, and looked directly at Evelyn. Her eyes held a mixture of desperate command and absolute certainty that I would fold under the pressure of the audience. She believed the social architecture of the room was too dense for me to break. I set the pen down on the linen tablecloth beside the verification form. I did not drop it aggressively. I placed it there with deliberate, careful precision. "I cannot sign this," I said. My voice was not loud, but the acoustic design of the private dining room carried the quiet syllables perfectly to the other end of the table. "I cannot verify a system architecture that I have never audited, and I cannot validate a consent form bearing an electronic signature that I never provided." Helen reacted with the terrifying speed of a woman whose entire existence was predicated on managing public relations. She let out a soft, breathy laugh, placing a warm hand over mine. "Linda works in corporate risk," Julian, Helen explained, directing a brilliant, apologetic smile toward the Ashcroft family. "She is incredibly pedantic about internal testing. She simply means we need to formalize her audit process before she signs the final paperwork. It is just sibling perfectionism. I did not pull my hand away from my mother's grip. I simply unzipped the black leather portfolio resting on my lap and brought out the first stack of papers. It is not perfectionism, Mother, I corrected her, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. It is forensic compliance. I slid the first document across the polished mahogany toward Marcus Thorne, the auditor from Hawthorne Due Diligence. It was the metadata analysis of the consent form. Mr. Thorne, the document you emailed me yesterday contains an electronic signature extracted from an unrelated insurance form I signed 3 years ago, I stated clearly. The embedded metadata confirms that the PDF was generated and modified on an IP address corresponding to Evelyn Windsor's primary laptop exactly 2 weeks ago. I did not authorize my appointment as head of security, and my identity has been used to bypass your initial technical screening. The silence that descended upon the table was sudden and absolute. The ambient clinking of silverware from the adjacent dining rooms seemed to vanish. Marcus Thorne did not speak. He calmly reached into his breast pocket, retrieved a pair of reading glasses, and began studying the metadata printout. Evelyn's face lost its color entirely. She opened her mouth to speak, but the carefully rehearsed Silicon Valley vocabulary failed to materialize. This is highly inappropriate, Linda, Graham interrupted, his voice dropping an octave as he attempted to assert patriarchal control over a situation rapidly slipping from his grasp. We can discuss your administrative grievances privately at home. This is not the time or the place. This is precisely the time and the place, Dad, I replied, looking toward the far end of the table where Julian Ashcroft was sitting perfectly still. Because this is the exact moment an administrative grievance transitions into investment fraud. I pulled the next set of documents from the portfolio and placed them in the center of the table. I did not raise my voice. I presented the evidence with the exact same detached professionalism I used during corporate board meetings in Canary Wharf. Evelyn claims to have coded the foundational data sorting algorithms for CivicMind during her final months in California, I continued, addressing the room but looking specifically at Julian's legal team. The GitHub repository commit logs show that 94% of the backend architecture was uploaded from a commercial subnet in Bucharest, Romania. Furthermore, the supposed local government housing datasets used to train the model are not proprietary municipal records. They are publicly available, anonymized dummy datasets routinely used for undergraduate computer science projects. Sir Malcolm Ashcroft lowered his wine glass slowly. He looked at his son, and then he looked at Evelyn. The polite, aristocratic warmth had completely evaporated from his expression, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a man who managed billions of pounds in institutional capital. Helen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. I apologize for this entirely unprovoked outburst. My younger daughter has always struggled with Evelyn's success. We will excuse ourselves and allow the legal team to sit down, Mrs. Windsor, Marcus Thorne said. The auditor did not raise his voice, but the command carried the absolute authority of the firm he represented. He looked up from the technical printouts and focused on Helen. It ceases to be a family matter the moment fraudulent documents are submitted to a regulated financial institution for the purpose of securing venture capital. I reached into the back of my portfolio and extracted the single sheet of paper from the National Student Clearinghouse. I did not slide it toward the auditor. I placed it directly in front of Julian Ashcroft. The emails from her supposed academic advisor were routed through a commercial server in Iceland, I explained calmly. The QR code on her student identification card directs to a privately hosted website template. And the document in front of you is a direct query from the centralized university degree verification database. Julian looked down at the paper. I watched his eyes scan the minimal text. I watched him read the words "no record found" next to Evelyn's name. Julian slowly looked up from the paper and stared at the woman he had intended to marry. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly disoriented, like a man who had stepped onto a solid floor and found nothing but empty space. Evelyn, Julian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you attend Stanford University? Evelyn stared at him. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. She looked to Helen for a script, for a diversion, for a way to rewrite the reality of the room, but the social architecture had completely collapsed. There was no angle left to play. She made a mistake when she was very young, Helen interjected, desperation finally cracking the edges of her perfect hostess facade. She was breathing rapidly, her hands clutching the edge of the table. She was under an immense amount of pressure, Julian. You know how competitive the industry is. We simply helped her curate a narrative so she could get her foot in the door. The concept of civic mind is still brilliant. I looked at my mother, recognizing that, even in the face of absolute ruin, she was perfectly willing to let Evelyn absorb the entirety of the blame as long as the family name survived. She was framing this as a momentary lapse in a young girl's judgment. I refused to let them sacrifice the daughter they had meticulously built. I reached into the very bottom of my portfolio and pulled out the thick stack of papers printed from the blue archive folder. I placed them on the table, spreading them out so the specific dates and letterheads were clearly visible. It was not a momentary lapse, and it was not Evelyn's exclusive decision, I said, looking directly at my parents. I laid down the official rejection letter. This is the rejection notice from the Stanford Office of Undergraduate Admission. It arrived at our house in Manchester 11 days before you hosted the acceptance party. I laid down the itemized financial records next. These are the wire transfers initiated by my father to a boutique reputation management agency in Palo Alto, California, paying for an academic profile cleanup, a luxury short-term rental apartment, and a professional photographer to stage her orientation pictures. Finally, I placed the printed email chain titled the Julian track directly beside the wire transfers. And this is the internal family strategy document outlining exactly which philanthropic galas Evelyn needed to attend in London to secure an introduction to Julian Ashcroft, explicitly stating that a marriage into his family would neutralize the initial cost of the deception. The silence returned, but it was no longer the heavy silence of anticipation. It was the sterile, vacant silence of an evacuated building. Lady Beatrice Ashcroft stood up. She did not look at Helen or Graham. She simply picked up her evening bag and turned toward the door. Sir Malcolm gestured to his legal counsel, a silent command to immediately freeze the escrow accounts and terminate all communication with Civic Mind. Julian remained seated for a moment longer. He looked at Evelyn, who was now weeping silently, her tears ruining the expensive foundation she had applied for the celebration. Julian reached into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket. He withdrew a small, square velvet box, an engagement ring that was meant to be presented over dessert. He looked at the box, tracing his thumb over the velvet lid, before quietly placing it back into his pocket. He stood up and followed his parents out of the dining room without saying a single word. Marcus Thorne carefully gathered the documents I had provided, placed them into his own briefcase, and nodded to me once before exiting through the double doors. The four of us were left alone in the massive, opulent room. The roasted pheasant sat untouched on the imported porcelain plates. The crystal chandeliers continued to cast their warm, fractured light over the devastation. Graham leaned heavily against the table, looking older and vastly smaller than he ever had before. He looked across the ruined dinner service at me. "Linda," my father whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and profound resentment. "That is enough." I closed my empty black portfolio and stood up from the table. I looked at my father, then at my mother, who was staring at the doorway the Ashcrofts had just walked through, completely unable to process the destruction of her empire. "No, Dad," I replied, my voice steady, carrying the quiet peace of a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows. "Enough is when everyone stops forcing me to sign my name under a lie." I turned my back on the table, walked out of the private dining room, and left them alone in the beautiful, expensive reality they had bought for themselves. Chapter 11. The Things That Fall Outside the Spotlight. The collapse of a multi-million-pound fraud does not happen with a cinematic explosion. It happens through a series of quiet, bureaucratic severances. It happens in the sterile language of legal notices, the immediate revocation of digital access credentials, and the sudden, deafening absence of returned phone calls. By 9 o'clock the morning after the dinner at the Midland Hotel, Marcus Thorne had officially submitted his findings to the investment committee at Julian Ashcroft's fund. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how the machinery operated. The fund immediately withdrew from the term sheet, issuing a standard non-disclosure termination notice that effectively radioactive the Civic Mind portfolio. Within 48 hours, the Manchester City Council quietly suspended all exploratory dialogues regarding their municipal housing database, citing unforeseen technical compliance reviews. Evelyn was not arrested, but the civil consequences were immediate and suffocating. Because she had submitted manipulated data sets and fabricated academic credentials during a formal due diligence process, she was forced to retain a team of defense solicitors specializing in corporate misrepresentation. She had to return the initial seed capital she had secured from smaller, local investors, completely draining her personal accounts. By the end of the week, the elegantly designed Civic Mind website was replaced by a blank white screen displaying a generic server hosting error. For my mother, the financial ruin of the startup was entirely secondary to the catastrophic destruction of her social capital. Helen had spent over a decade using Evelyn's fictional Stanford degree as the primary currency to purchase her seat at the most exclusive tables in Manchester. When the Ashcroft family abruptly severed all ties, the sudden vacuum generated immediate whispers within their highly insulated social circle. 3 weeks after the dinner, Helen received a politely worded, devastatingly formal letter from the executive committee of her most prestigious philanthropic board. They expressed deep gratitude for her past contributions, but suggested that, given the current complex circumstances surrounding her family's business ventures, it would be best if she stepped down from her chairmanship to focus on private matters. It was the aristocratic equivalent of an execution. My father attempted to manage the fallout using the only strategy he had ever known, minimizing the damage and avoiding direct accountability. He did not call me. He sent a series of text messages over the course of 2 weeks, each one a slight variation of the same cowardly theme. You do not understand the kind of pressure your mother was under to maintain appearances. We could have handled this internally, Linda. There were discreet ways to restructure the paperwork without destroying your sister's reputation. At the end of the day, she is still your family. I read the messages as they appeared on my locked screen, but I did not reply. There was nothing left to explain to a man who believed that protecting a lie was a greater moral imperative than protecting his own daughter. It was Evelyn who finally broke the silence with a phone call exactly 1 month after the dinner. I was sitting at my kitchen island in London, reviewing a preliminary security audit for a new client, when her name illuminated my phone screen. I let it ring 3 times before accepting the call, placing the device on speakerphone while I continued to type. "They are forcing me to liquidate the apartment in Kensington," Evelyn said. She bypassed any greeting, speaking into the receiver with a voice that was hoarse, hollow, and entirely stripped of the polished Silicon Valley cadence she had worn for years. "The solicitors require a massive retainer, and the remaining investors are threatening a civil suit to recover their administrative costs." I stopped typing and looked at the glowing screen of my phone. I did not offer sympathy, nor did I offer to review her legal documents. I simply waited for her to arrive at the actual purpose of the call. "Julian will not even speak to me through his legal counsel," Evelyn continued, the quiet desperation bleeding through the line. "He blocked my number the morning after the dinner. I spent my entire adult life trying to be the exact person they all wanted, and now I have absolutely nothing left." She paused, taking a ragged breath. When she spoke again, the residual entitlement of the golden child flared up, a final, dying ember of the dynamic we had always shared. "I hate you, Linda," Evelyn whispered, the words carrying the heavy, exhausted weight of absolute defeat. "I hate you because you did the right thing, and you did not even hesitate to watch me fall." I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the gray, uninterrupted skyline of Canary Wharf. I felt a profound sense of sorrow for her, but it was the kind of sorrow one feels for a stranger who has driven their car into a wall while ignoring every warning sign. "No, Evelyn," I replied, my voice steady and entirely devoid of malice. "You do not hate me because I did the right thing. You hate me because you could no longer use me to continue doing the wrong thing." The line went completely silent. She did not argue. She did not attempt to deploy our mother's rhetoric about family loyalty or shared sacrifice. The architecture of our past had been completely dismantled, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. "Do you think I am a monster?" Evelyn asked, the question small and incredibly fragile in the empty space between us. "I do not think you are a monster," I told her honestly. "But I know you are a person who made calculated decisions with devastating consequences. And for the first time in your life, you are going to have to stay in the room and live with those consequences." I ended the call. I did not block her number, but I knew she would not call again. She had finally realized that the background mechanic was no longer available to repair the illusion. Chapter 12. My name belongs to me. The transition into the subsequent months was remarkably quiet. I returned to my regular operational cadence at the risk management firm, immersing myself in the logical, binary reliability of data architecture. I was assigned as the lead security auditor for a large nonprofit organization dedicated to building transparent, encrypted communication platforms for first-generation university students. Sitting in the briefing room, reviewing the actual, functional datasets designed to provide equitable educational access to underprivileged teenagers, the contrast was incredibly sharp. Out here, in the real world, there were systems built on genuine equity, designed to uplift people who actually needed the infrastructure. My family had treated education as an imported luxury good, a designer label to be forged and worn to dinner parties to extract investments from wealthy heirs. It was during a quiet Tuesday afternoon in my office that I drafted the final correspondence to my family. I did not write a long, emotional declaration of independence. I treated the communication exactly as I would treat a corporate severance protocol. I opened a new email, addressed it to Helen and Graham, and copied Evelyn. From this date forward, my name, my professional title, and my digital signature are not to be utilized in any familial introductions, investment portfolios, or social narratives without my explicit, written consent. I will not attend any dinners, galas, or gatherings designed to manage the public relations of this family. I am stepping entirely out of the frame. Please do not attempt to negotiate these boundaries. I pressed send and closed the application. Helen replied less than an hour later with a sprawling, 4-paragraph email detailing her absolute heartbreak, accusing me of tearing the family apart over a technicality, and listing the numerous financial sacrifices she had made during my childhood. I read the first sentence, recognized the familiar architecture of her guilt, and moved the entire thread to a designated archive folder. However, late that evening, a separate email arrived from my father's private account. It contained no subject line and consisted of only a single sentence. "I knew what we were doing, Linda, and I stayed silent." I stared at the brief line of text. It was not a complete apology, nor was it an offer of restitution. But it was a factual admission of reality, a tiny fragment of truth extracted from a man who had spent a decade funding a lie. I did not reply to him. I simply saved the email to my secure local drive, preserving it as documentary evidence that I was not the one who had imagined the dysfunction. 2 weeks later, the physical remnants of the past finally lost their grip. I was walking through a vintage charity shop in East London, searching for a specific type of brass lamp for my living room, when I turned down the clothing aisle. Hanging on the end of a metal clothing rack, wedged between faded denim jackets and woolen sweaters, was a heavy, deep red hooded sweatshirt. Across the chest, the word Stanford was printed in bold, cracking white letters. I stopped in the aisle. For a decade, that specific shade of red and those specific white letters had been the absolute center of gravity in my household. That logo had dictated my schedule, minimized my achievements, and nearly cost me my professional freedom. It had been the holy artifact of my mother's religion. I reached out and touched the fabric. It was just cotton. It was slightly worn at the cuffs, entirely ordinary, holding absolutely no power whatsoever. I let my hand drop, turned my back on the rack, and walked out of the shop into the bright, sharp air of the London afternoon. The following morning, I arrived at Canary Wharf early. I swiped my security badge at the primary turnstile, listening to the quiet, satisfying mechanism of the gate unlocking. As I stepped into the elevator, I looked down at the laminated identification card clipped to my lapel. It displayed my photograph, unedited and uncropped. Beneath the picture, the crisp black text read, Linda Windsor, Senior Cybersecurity Analyst. I used to believe that exposing the truth would completely destroy my family. I had spent years absorbing their failures because I was terrified of what would happen when the structure finally collapsed. But as the elevator carried me upward toward the secure server rooms, I realized that the truth had not destroyed anything of actual value. The truth is merely a mechanism of verification. It does not punish, it simply strips away the fiction. It took away the venture capital, the aristocratic engagement, and the imported dinner parties, but those things had never really existed in the first place. I did not leave my family. I only left the role they had forced me to play. And for the first time in my life, I understood that my silence was no longer a required surrender. My silence was simply peace.